Welcome in, Shield brothers and Shield maidens, to Shield's Rest. I'm Brown.
And I'm True.
In Cross Shields, we're converting content from tabletop role-playing games such as Dungeons & Dragons into usable material for the Daggerheart and DC20.
We feel that you should have as much content as possible for the systems you love.
If it's your first time watching, or you're a returning viewer and haven't made the commitment just yet, consider subscribing or show some support with a like or comment.
Now unrest those shields and get ready to cross them.
Alright, so today, Mark and I are going to be converting over the Gnoll Hunter and the Gnoll Flesh Gnawer from D&D's Volo's Guide to Monsters. We thought these would be just absolutely iconic adversaries to start with first, as well as just great as low-tier adversaries for you to be able to bring into random encounters or intentional encounters. Whether as a story arc or a mainstay of your campaign, doesn't matter what, you can always use Gnolls. You gotta have them, right? You just absolutely have to have them. So, to that end, we're going to be converting them over into Daggerheart and DC20. So if you're interested in the DC20 side of the house, go ahead and skip over to Mark's conversion. He's got you taken care of. So starting off with Daggerheart, if you have not seen my video on how to tier up or tier down an adversary, go ahead and check that out real quick, because it is going to help you understand how I am looking at bringing adversaries into Daggerheart. Because although we are talking about powering up and powering down adversaries in that video, it's the same tables that I'm going to be using to bring in adversaries into usable Daggerheart stat blocks, okay? So check that out when you get a second. So starting off with the Gnoll Hunter. The Gnoll Hunter makes a great tier 1 ranged asset in your arsenal of very melee heavy gnolls, okay? Which you'll see here as we go through these videos for all the gnolls that we're converting. So for this one ranged individual, the only ranged gnoll, they're going to have a difficulty of 11, they're going to have an attack modifier of +1, and then a longbow very far range, 2d6 plus 3 physical damage. They're also going to be coming to the table with 7 major and 12 severe, as well as 3 hit points and 2 stress. You cannot go wrong with this. And then the experience of Tracker +2. Now getting into the Gnoll Hunter's features, we want to start off with Violent Urge, which is a passive feature. Now this is basically a reskin of the Rampage feature from the D&D side that this Gnoll comes with, but instead of using Volos for the outlook of that feature, we're actually going to use the new Monster Manuals feature of Rampage, where they've done a great quality of life change for that feature, because in Volos it was very circumstantial in which you'd use Rampage. Was not a huge fan of that. However, from the new Monster Manual, I do like that you can use it basically once per day or twice per day, depending on which Gnoll you're looking at. As far as this Gnoll Hunter is concerned, we're going to go ahead and make this once per scene, so that way it's usable once within the encounter in which this Gnoll appears. So pretty great for that. I do like that. Just as an easy one that you can check off and be done with it once it's used, okay? But in order to use it, after making a successful attack, the Gnoll Hunter basically just needs to mark a stress to be able to make another bite attack. So instead of them just basically only having the one attack and being done, they have this option if they've had a successful attack. So that's what I like about this. And then they deal 1d6 plus 2 physical damage if so. Now getting into Unseen Strike. Unseen Strike is a great passive for a Gnoll Hunter to have, because it plays into the way that the hunter is supposed to be, right? Somebody that's hidden, waiting for their time, the right opportunity to attack. And that's exactly what this is. So if the Gnoll Hunter is hidden when they hit an enemy, the attack deals 2d8 plus 5 physical damage instead of the normal 2d6 plus 3 physical damage. So that should help the Gnoll a little bit more in terms of being able to strike and strike hard, especially out of nowhere, and basically it'll help us create that ambush sort of scenario and really hit the players pretty hard. Alright, now getting into the Gnoll Flesh Gnawer. Not only is that a hard name to say, but it is a great adversary to bring to the table as a tier 1 skulk type adversary. So this is going to be coming to the table with a difficulty of 12, plus 2 for their attack modifier, and short swords, melee 2d4 plus 5 physical damage. They're also coming to the table with a major 8 and a severe 14, with 4 HP and 2 stress, and the experience Patient Killer, +2. So the reason why we want to bring in this Patient Killer for their experience is because we want them to kind of play out a little bit more like they are waiting and biding their time to completely eviscerate whoever they're going after. So they can play out as this, or you can make it more vicious with +2 as their experience instead of the patient killer, and then that way you can almost turn this into a berserker type adversary. Even though there's no berserker type adversary, you can basically make it more like a berserker where they're just going to run in and just be trying to kill anyone and everyone that they see. So just an idea for that. Now, getting into their features, they are of course going to be coming with the Violent Urge feature, as we talked about with the Gnoll Hunter. And that's going to be the same across the board for every single Gnoll, except for the fact that sometimes they'll switch up between whether they can use it twice per scene or once per scene. The Gnoll Flesh Gnawer is going to go ahead and have it as a once per scene. Now, getting into Gnoll speed, this is a great feature for the Gnoll Flesh Gnawer to have because it allows them to basically rush in extremely fast. So instead of moving up to close range, if they mark a stress, they can go up to far range and just run right in and start attacking. That's the great part about it, is you can use this basically to mark one of their stress, one of the two, to rush in, strike, and then if they're successful with that strike, you can then mark the secondary stress and go ahead and do the Violent Urge bite attack. Great way to use that so that way your party doesn't stress your Gnolls out before you do. Alright, I hope that helps you guys out, so let me know down below what you might do differently with these two conversions, how you might do it a little bit better. You know, what might you change, what might you increase, whatever. If you want to know more about how I'm actually converting these, let me know down in the comments and maybe I'll add that into the next video. But if you're interested in the DC20 side, just continue watching because Mark has a great conversion for both the Gnoll Hunter and the Gnoll Flesh Gnawer.
Welcome in, Shield Brothers and Shield Maidens. As this is our first video in the Cross Shield series, I'd like to take a moment to just cover a few housekeeping items for DC20. In this system, monsters are called monsters. However, I'm going to be referring to them as adversaries, just for the sake of the video in the series, so that both Daggerheart and DC20 stat blocks can be referred to under one term. Next, we have adversary difficulties, which are going to be the ones listed on the screen here. I'm not going to go over all of them, but the ones that you'll see in this video are low tier and mid tier. So for low tier, it's going to be your one turn kill, slight challenge, quick victory. Mid tier is going to be 2 or more rounds of combat, requiring some strategy and coordination. Now, my hope in this series is to cover at least one of these, right? But most likely we will still be in that low to mid tier range, maybe high tier here and there, just because of DC20 and its early stages of the development. Now, for our first adversary, we're going to be covering Gnolls. So what I have here is a Gnoll Hunter, and if you're familiar with the D&D 5e version of the Gnoll Hunter, you'll probably see a lot of similarities in here, and you should, because that's what we're converting it from. Now, a few things to go over here. You can see that this is a medium humanoid, same as it is in D&D. However, you see level 2 sniper. Now, these different categories really just are what type of adversary is that, right? And there's a cheat sheet you can look at to help identify that, but not important for these videos. What's important is that level 2. There are currently level 1, level 2, and it goes on through the levels. But that's important because at the higher levels, you'll start to see the combat mastery change. However, for level 1 and 2, combat mastery is half your level rounded up. So it's still going to be a 1. And that's what you'll see throughout these stat blocks in this video. Here we have HP of 7 because this is supposed to be that low tier 1 turn of combat. Now, if you're facing a party of 2 player characters, probably one of these is good. If you're facing a party of 3, you probably want to add a second one of these, or maybe a Gnoll Flesh Gnawer, which we'll be covering next. But we want to keep this kind of weak and not much of a threat, but as we read through the stat block, you'll see how this can quickly turn into a very big threat. For the attributes, same thing from D&D 5e, so the conversion is basically 1 for 1, except for some differences like wisdom and intelligence both exist in D&D 5e, where in DC20 they're combined into just intelligence. So what we're doing in our stat blocks is just adding those totals up from the D&D 5e stat block and then averaging them out, or maybe using some judgment calls just to make that what we feel it should be for this stat block. The number in parentheses, such as those next to might and agility, mean that they have a save in that attribute, but also their combat mastery is applied to that. That ties into skills, for example, where awareness, which is DC20's version of perception, is a +3 because that is based off of your prime modifier, which in this case could be either might or agility, but either way, they're both 3 with that combat mastery, so that's why that's +3. And then stealth obviously is based off of agility, or what would be dexterity in D&D 5e, which is also 3 based on the number that we have there. Next, we have senses, which most Gnolls have dark vision. Now in DC20, they don't use feet, they use spaces. So 12 spaces, multiply that by 5 would be 60 feet. That's how we got that number. For features, we've given most of the Gnolls Rampage, not all of them as you'll see as we move through this, but it does work much differently than the D&D 5e version, which is also called Rampage. I didn't feel like customizing it to change it because Rampage exists in DC20, so I thought it'd be really cool to run with that and use that from the DC20 system. Just really quick, in the D&D 5e version, the Rampage is when the Gnoll reduces a creature to 0 hit points with a melee attack during its turn. It can take a bonus action, move up to half of its speed, and make a bite attack. Much different, right? In this one, you're literally just getting a +1 damage increase every round. However, that does compound. So if this Gnoll lives 4 rounds, it's getting +4 damage from its Rampage feature. So you're definitely a real threat, and you want to dispatch these as quickly as possible. Next, we have the action point system, which most of these adversaries that we're covering are going to have 4 action points or more. We will not be covering a minion under the Gnoll category. However, we do have another low tier Gnoll that will probably get some reduced actions just based on them being a 1/4 challenge rating in the D&D 5e system. This Gnoll Hunter is a half challenge rating, so it's, you know, your standard monster essentially, standard adversary. For this, we're going to have +4 attack, which most of them will. The save DC is a flat 14. Most of them will have that unless they're boss or solo level, then they'll usually get a plus up on that. And then speed 5 is kind of the standard. You might see more or less. And again, you can tweak that depending on what you want for the encounter that you might be using this in. Next, we have the attack options, right? So the Gnoll Hunter in D&D 5e has multi-attack. Most of the Gnolls have multi-attack. We're not putting that on this stat block because in DC20, multi-attack is always an option. Not to get into that, but you have 4 action points. You can use those to attack 4 times if you want. However, you'll get a penalty that will make you less effective in landing that attack. So watch another video that we have or read into that. However, multi-attack is always an option, so not written on the card because you can do it whenever you want. However, they do have bite, which is just your standard melee 1 piercing damage. That takes 1 action point to use it. And then we have the spear, which is similar, melee and 1 piercing. However, we've given this Gnoll the spear style, so it deals an additional 1 damage against creatures if it's moved at least 2 spaces towards it immediately before making the attack check. And then also Gnolls, most of them have the longbow option, which we've given here. The range again is in spaces, so 30 spaces or 90 spaces is your range. It does a little bit more damage, 2 piercing, but it takes 2 action points if you notice that. Also, it does have a bow style advantage, which deals +1 to creatures that are slowed. As you can see, this Gnoll Hunter can do a lot of damage to a slowed creature, especially if it's lived a few rounds in the combat. So definitely can be a threat on its own, even though it has 7 HP and low defenses. For attack enhancements, you can really flavor this however you want, but I just thought it'd be interesting to give it hamstring because that allows you to potentially affect the target with slowed. Let's say we do a spear attack, right? We move 2 spaces towards a player character. We attack with a spear and we add the hamstring attack enhancement. So you're looking to do, that's 2 damage base, plus they make a save to see if they get slowed. If they are slowed, then that lasts their next turn. Next we'll be covering the Gnoll Flesh Gnawer. And it's hard to say that name, so I'll try to avoid saying that as much as I can, but I might say it a few times. Apologize if that gets on anyone's nerves. But next we have this Gnoll Flesh Gnawer. So again, medium humanoid, level 1 this time, and a bruiser, not a sniper, so there's the difference there. Again, you can read more about those in the DC20 system. However, you'll notice that this is a mid-tier and not a low tier. Again, this just means it's a little bit beefier. So you can see it's automatically got several more hit points. It's got higher physical defense, and sometimes its attributes are a little higher, but in this case, they're relatively averaged out. I won't cover those too much because we already talked about it, but essentially this one in D&D 5e does not have any specific skills mentioned, so it doesn't have the same awareness or stealth that the Hunter had. This just has dark vision, 12 spaces. And with a feature here, I went a little bit different with the Flesh Gnawer. Instead of giving it Rampage, which you could give it both if you'd like to, and just make all Gnolls have that, but What I thought was interesting here was to give this the full disengage feature. So whenever you take the disengage action, which you'll see down below, you can spend 1 action point to disengage. This lets you become immune to opportunity attacks until the start of your next turn. So this thing can really get in and out and move around and avoid taking extra damage by switching targets. So as a GM, for example, you could have your hunter out there sniping people and maybe trying to sneak up on them and apply slowed. And then you've got this thing just moving in and out of all around the battlefield. The players are probably going to focus on this one if it's attacking multiple ones of them versus the hunter who might have a single target in mind. However, as a GM, you can do that however you want and run the encounter to your liking. Just getting back to the attack actions here. So again, it's +4 attack, 14 DC, speed 5. Like I said, those are kind of across the board for now. It also has bite. Most gnolls have bite. This one, however, has a short sword instead of a spear. So with the short sword, it costs 2. It does 2 melee slashing, and also has sword style, so it can deal 1 additional damage against creatures that are exposed. Now, there are several ways that a creature, player character or creature can expose itself or be hit by exposed. So that's pretty useful. However, this Gnoll Flesh Gnawer also has the attack enhancement of expose. So imagine that your Flesh Gnawer and your Hunter are both trying to apply slow and expose every turn, which means the next turn they're going to get hit a little bit harder, right? But that's it for the Gnoll Hunter and the Gnoll Flesh Gnawer, and look forward to the next video where we will be covering the Gnoll Witherling, which is the 1/4 challenge rating, and the Flend, which is a 9 challenge rating. So we're jumping around a little bit, but wanted to give you a breadth of availability for these adversary stat blocks. Let us know what you think about the series. Until next time, keep that shield wall strong.